Welcome to Radio Locura 66.666 FM, Idiotic Ideas for Intelligent People, the podcast where we talk about the most interesting and functionally useless things, such as the arts, people who lost their minds trying to find a new way of perceiving the world, i.e. artists, and, after death, they reach their peak popularity because that's how unfair the passage of time is. I'm Alex Suriana. I invite you to follow me on Instagram as it's appearing right now in front of your screen and listen to all my music on all platforms, especially my latest album, Fox Cinema, where I have songs by excellent music producers and artists such as Björk Rosalia, among others. Okay, my name is Javier at Más o Menos, as it's written on the screen with a Z at the end, Más o Menos Literatura, my personal channel where I share things that nobody cares about, but everyone finds useful, things like book reviews, declarations of love that are extremely urgent about lyrics and that may interest you. Subscribe, like this episode, and also like my channel. Well, that would be my presentation for this occasion. Don't forget that we are selling the shirts of some episodes. At the moment, we only have the one of Alejandro Pizarnik. You want to see it's the previous episode, and there you can see the models. Soon, we will also be putting on Instagram how to get them in a more accessible way, but for now, you can get them by sending a message to Instagram, Radio Locura 66.6 FM. And, well, that would be all. Remember that madness. And that being an animal is not so bad. Let's watch the intro, and we're back. Radio Locura 66.6. On a moderate frequency. Stupid ideas for smart people. Goodbye. And now let's get to the topic of this episode, celebrating our 30th episode. My friend from Radio Locura, the number that ends the tens of 20's, was a sins of 20's. The number 30 will be conspicuous by its absence this time to talk about the importance of its 10 previous numbers. Well, exactly. This time in a special episode, My Little Wig. Natty Palooza. This time in a special and very unique episode, we will be talking about the 20's, especially those that happened back in the distant 20th century, the last century, but also making certain acronym contributions that share or differ from our own times. Yeah. We will take a deep look, perhaps in a subtle attempt to review how much culture has changed on a general level in the last century and delve a little into this historical period that ended up becoming more than a period between world wars, an oasis for creativity, and the madness of humanity from every angle. Sure. They call them happy, golden, crazy. But those 20's of 1920's were a decade marked by economic prosperity, audacity, and frivolity, a new world that was reborn from the worst of the war where the arts and the creation of the avant-garde flourished. Times when the use of automobiles and telephones, brand new gadgets promising a life of comfort, will become popular. Jazz is the new soundtrack, and the Charleston encourages the flappers, leaders of female sexual liberation, to shake up customs and freely reveal their bodies. Women cut their hair like a boy, like a boy, like a big boy, like a big boy. And men shave their beards. That's right. The chaos reached the Berlin Cabaret. The explosion of architecture and fashion also took on an intellectual height. Inflation in Germany and Austria rendered banknotes worthless from one day to the next, and fed the damned germ of Nazism. The decade begins. In this decade, the Vatican State is founded. Franz Kafka dies. Television is born. Hitler is preparing his genocidal joke. Alexander Fleming, the pharmacist, discovers the ha-ha. The pharmacist discovers the damn penicillin. The Museum of Modern Art is founded. In New York, the radio and household appliances become popular, as does consumer culture, a time of profound contradictions that we will delve into. And as if that were not enough, a change in consciousness occurs that is reflected in the material world in many ways, even in the political sphere plagued by conservatism, which even in our times continues to be a bug that we cannot get rid of. The Roaring Twenties have quite a few similarities with our own 20s of the 2000s, such as the brutalization of politics accompanied by the rise of communications and the attempt to destroy the past with a view to creating a better future. Building new hanging gardens of Babylon, burning the foundations of the past many times out of sheer disgust at not wanting to be slaves to it any longer, many times without even wanting to turn to look at it. That's why today we're going to reclaim the past, we're going to reclaim the future by analyzing what's happening today. Let's delve into this very special decade of the 20th century through literature, the visual arts, music, film, architecture, and along etc. to discover and reflect on the things we've been better at and the things we've sadly done better and the things we've done worse, apart from continuing to fall into them, in this decade we live in, which I propose to call the dystopian 20s. Okay, well, through art, a symptom of the culture and spirit of the times, we'll take a look at why art should be unpleasant. As Santa Claus, or rather, as a Mexican writer, Cesar A. Cruz would say, art should console the disturbed and disturb the comfortable. Okay. So let's go, my friend, with the literature section, please. And remember it well, Lice. These are the Roaring Twenties. This is the episode about that. Okay. Literature. We'll start with literature, because it's the base. You know that nobody cares, but everyone can use literature, right? So I'm going to make the obligatory mentions like this, look, bullet after bullet. But we'll start with an absolute classic of the 20s, at least in English, and then for the world, right? Scott Fitzgerald. Okay. The writer. I'm going to mention two works. He has more, but they are the most important of the 20s. On the one hand, The Great Gatsby, right? Published in 2025. And on the other hand, a short story that was later also made into a movie, which is The Curious Case of Benjamin Button. They published in 2022. Baby boy of the old boy. The baby boy of the old man. Of the old man. Of the old man of the old man.
Of the baby boy. Anyway, The Curious Case of Benjamin Button, as my podcast partner has already explained in a very practical way, is the story of Benjamin, who is born an old man, right?
A button is
born an old button. And in that sense, well, in the movie, we see it very clearly, right? With Brad Pitt. They're leaving the hospital, and it also happens in the story. There are certain differences, but what I want to highlight is that inversion of time, which is the most obvious thing about this story. What's this story? Of course.
Instead of growing, he shrinks. Instead of understanding from the beginning what it means to speak and discover the first colors, shapes, lights, at the beginning, he is born talking. At the beginning, he is already well into the issue, at least communicative, of language, even though he is a newborn, right? He's already old. The bastard already has wrinkles. Of course he does. And in fact, in the story, he asks his dad to get him clothes and even get him a cane, right? Then Benjamin's father takes him out of the hospital and takes him out like he's carrying a great-grandfather, something like that, right? From there, the issue of growing up will continue. He will also experience first love. For the first time, he will also suffer it. He will go through it, but he looks like he's 50 years old. And the person he falls in love with, the girl he falls in love with, is in her 20s, right? 29 at the latest. And in that sense, they can connect well. And then as he grows and she continues to grow, they get rid of old credit. Old credit. Yes, they get rid of it. And in that same sense, he ends up reaching adolescence. He can finally study where he couldn't, college, right? And then he enters high school, and then ends up in kindergarten, and then he stays with his nanny. And the last thing he sees, and it's beautifully written in the story, is the lights, the colors, the lights, and how everything goes out, right? When he dies, becoming a baby again, right? Now, yes, a baby grandfather. A baby grandfather. That's the curious case of Benjamin Bottom, and what I want you to take away from this story is that there is a very strong concern on the part of Fitzgerald, of Scott Gerald, for questioning time, how aging works, obviously, but also how building a mind works, not building a story. Despite the fact that this old boy is born into a family that continues to do well as time goes by, he achieves greater stability and so on. He understands everything in reverse, and that is much of the feeling of the 20s, right? Understanding that within that great growth, there is a constant decrease. Let's say not in the quality of life, because household appliances start to appear. All these issues of prosperity start to appear. But there begins to be a disconnect with oneself, right? With oneself in that sense. And of course, you can scratch it more, right? But the curious case of Benjamin Bottom, that's also why it's curious, right? In the Roaring 20s. That's right. Now, moving on to the issue of The Grand Gatsby, which is the novel of the American 1920s, right? Americans. Basically, what it tells is the discovery of Gatsby's story, right? Of the great Gatsby, who throws parties in his mansion in New York, in a recreation of L Island, right? In that very wealthy area and so on, where he always throws parties, so that a lost love can come, right? The girl who, when he went off to war, oh, how it hurts, how sad, comes back and doesn't want to be with him anymore. They don't disconnect, right? The way the guy holds on, right?
Holding on, but also a little creative and ingenious, which is, I'm going to throw the best parties in the whole county, in all of them, to, no. Or who knows? There may have been cases like that at that time, but in the novel, as far as I'm concerned, there aren't any.
And in that sense, let's go with the novel. Let's go back to the Great Gatsby novel. Let's leave Pip to hell. That way, I'm going to put on so many little lights so you'll listen to me. I'm going to dance so much. I'm going to make so much noise and let all the people pass by so you'll come back too. My love, I've lost you forever. That's the idea of the Great Gatsby, isn't it? And if it happens that they meet again, if it happens that they get back in touch, by this time she was already married to someone else. She already has a child, right? Right. She's already with offspring. And in that sense, neither of them is innocent that, only one is cheating on the other. No. They're both committing adultery, right?
At least not the couple. He wants to get back together, right? Great Gatsby. And what I want you to think about here is not just how it's resolved because he ends up being a tragic hero, but the way in which this story is told. The style of this novel is to tell everything from a friend of Grand Gatsby, who also happens to be the bridge that connects him to his beloved, right? Who is her cousin, right? The narrator of this story. So, Grand Gatsby becomes his friend in order to get much closer to his cousin and to consolidate their romantic reunion. In the end, he sacrifices himself, the Great Gatsby, and what the story ends up vindicating, at least for the narrator, is don't judge others, his father once told the narrator, because not everyone has had the same opportunities as you. Not everyone has had the same background as you to develop, and that's why he can tell this story. Despite the fact that there is adultery, despite the fact that there is exaggeration, waste, a lot of waste, and that waste of putting up lots of lights, of throwing the house out the window, it's literally a feeling very much from the Roaring 20s.
Too much. It's the quintessential feeling, but also with a deep emptiness of not being able to get back the person you love or get to know them, or in general being out of step, right? It repeats a bit that feeling of time not quite fitting in, the spaces that are always looking to be filled and are never completely filled emotionally, as happens in another sense in the case of Benjamin Bottom's Curious. But this ability that Scott Fitzgerald had to recover this vivacity, the great colors, the bonanzas, the parties and everything, but inside he was neglecting himself, right? Society in the Roaring 20s. In general, that can happen in any era, but here it's very, very significant because all the technology, all the advances, all the bonanza, everything that arrived was hyperbolic, exaggerated, right? There was no way to stop that wealth, neither freedom nor the desire to also find something deeply enjoyable in something non-spiritual, something material, right? In a certain way, that is something that can also be seen in our times, right? It is a parallel that I see right now. Yes, of course. I mean, that idea that fortunately there can be prosperity in your life, right? But that can often happen. I'm not saying that it is the case for everyone, but that you do it to summon something deeper, right? Not to escape from it, but to rediscover it through there. That is, like excuses, like pretexts, like detours through money, waste, right? the party, the kind of superficial conversations, but you are looking for something else deep down, right? Deeper. Inside yourself.
To connect, to share. That's why the novel ends with a tragic hero, right, who sacrifices himself for his beloved after spending millions of dollars to throw these parties and reconnect with her. It's one of the best written novels in the English language, right? It has a fairly fluid style. It's not too demanding. I mean, if any of you are
very descriptive. If any of you speak English in that sense, you can read it in English and you'll totally understand it. No, it's not too elaborate, quite the opposite. It's very detailed, right? Very detailed. Very detailed. Very detailed, too. And it's very presented with this atmosphere of jazz, of partying, of dancing, right?
So, that's Scott Fitzgerald with two very iconic works from the 1920s that are absolutely nothing. Like the next one I'm going to look at, which is James Joyce. James Joyce, an Irish writer, published in 1922 what is considered to be the most important modern work in the English language, at least on the other side of the Atlantic, right? And which later spread worldwide, which is Ulysses. Joyce's Ulysses. This work is a novel that narrates the adventures and misadventures of its protagonist. Obviously, it has its own protagonist. It can't be the same as the ones written by Scott Gerald, right? Right? Whose name is no. No, well, maybe yes, but not right now. We'll see in the future. Now, the protagonist is Leopold Bloom, who tells himself this whole story during an 18-hour walk through the city of Dublin. It's a walk through the capital city of Bia.
Like a bus. Good morning. All the action takes place on this single day, June 16, 1904. That's where the novel is set. Joyce chose this date because it was the day he had his first date with the woman who would become his wife, Nora Barnacle. How romantic. And that's not the only romantic thing Josh does for his wife, because there are also a series of very, very, very intense, very explicit letters. If you like the thorny issue of love and bodies and fluids and so on. Erotic.
And above all, scatological. That reading of Joyce's letters to his wife might appeal to you, but he also had very nice gestures like placing things from his life in his own novel, in this case Ulysses. And throughout this day, the protagonist Leopold Bloom will encounter different characters and situations that will make him reflect on the relationship he has with his own wife, whose name is Molly Bloom, on the loss of a son he had, his relationship with friends, his past, and also, of course, as always, in the Roaring 20s, the expectations for the future.
Oh yes, very futuristic, wink wink. We'll talk about that a little bit in a moment.
So, this novel, that's what it's all about. However, it's very chaotic and very unstructured. Totally different from Scott Fitzgerald's writing. That's why it was very difficult to get published until a friend of his at a publishing house in France accepted it and everything. By the way, Virginia Woolf, who I'll talk about in this chapter, rejected Joyce's Ulysses. She read the draft and the manuscript and said, "This is crap. That really doesn't make any sense." Maybe she regretted it later, I'm not sure, I have no proof, but I have no doubt that she probably did, which is why this novel became so. But moving on to the question of the title of Ulysses alludes to the classical Greek protagonist, the hero Odysseus, right? Who, in Latin, well, in the Roman version, he's called Ulysses, right? Originally, it's Odysseus. And he appears in the Odyssey, which is a classic poem that tells of his adventures returning to Ithaca, right? To his kingdom, to be with his beloved again, right? So what Joyce does throughout the chapters is draw parallels between the classic work of the Odyssey and his own work of Ulysses, right? So there are two Ulysses, two Odysseus, who are living their journey, their walk back home. And in that sense,
very self-referential, precisely drawing parallels between them. He draws some very, very, very powerful parallels because each episode in this book corresponds to one of the characters in the Odyssey. The title and subtitles of each chapter have to do with these references to Greek mythology, right? To classical Greek literature. The one most closely related to Greek literature.
But if you read the story, he is an Irish protagonist whose day-to-day life has nothing to do with it, but there are parallels there. That's what's interesting, among other things, isn't it? So, of course, Leo Bloom is based on Odysseus, while Molly Bloom, the wife, would be a reinterpretation, a reversion of Penelope, right? Odysseus' wife.
Penelope. This novel is also very complex because it takes Santos from the present to the past, from this story that is happening. And each of these chapters is where Joyce said, I have the stinkiest one, the pen. I can do completely all the styles that there could be, and I'm even going to invent more, because each one has a different structure and has very direct styles, right? In some chapters, very classic, but the last chapter stands out above all, which is where there is a speech, right? A narration, an internal monologue of consciousness by Molly Bloom, the protagonist's wife, which is what closes the novel, right? Her thoughts flowing until the end. It has no commas, no periods. It's all fluid of what she's thinking, of what she's reflecting, of what she's experimenting with. Absolutely. It's one of the most experimental novels in history, or at least of the 20th century. Ulysses by Jim Foyce, 1922. It has nothing to do with what was happening with Scott Gerald, but nevertheless, it's already a very, very powerful announcement, many times, few times, deeply cared for at the time, because it is a pure experiment. And it does have a history, right? So what needs to be rescued and what is happening a lot right now are these experiments. The obvious thing to point out, in quote marks, obviously, artificial intelligence, the recreation of this technology for narratives, and also thinking that there are many ways to tell things, although it seems that we have already found them all, right? So these issues of transgender in literature, of the hybrid, are in 1922 with Joyce's Ulysses, and are also in our times, mainly, I would say, with video games, right? Above all, because they do not just tell you a story or just shoot or place you on a map or be an adventurer, but everything at the same time, leaning on you according to how skilled you are, or as you get the hang of it, right? Of course, there are more examples, but it seems to me that video games or programming too, even code and so on, that considers so many different languages at the same time, is a Joyce's Ulysses experimentation with other techniques in other arts, such as video games, or even design, right? A bit more multidimensional, right? So that's James Joyce, right? Also 1922 with Suze. Then, Virginia Woolf, I want to mention two of her works, and the most important thing about her are the bullets she fired, very peaceful, very well argued, but very powerful in defending the cause of women, right? Feminism, where on the one hand there was the issue of the vote that was granted to women after World War I, at least in Europe and in different cases in first world places, right? But the two I want to mention are Orlando from 1928 and A Room of One's Own from 1929. How did this woman write? Incredibly well. And very often, right? Orlando. Orlando is subtitled by Virginia Woolf as a biography. It tells part of the life of a young man who is already in the years of Elizabeth I, an aristocrat of the English court, who after falling asleep a little while like that, he wakes up one day transformed into a woman. This body is not mine.
My God. Rob Schneider. Rob Schneider as the progressive acceptance of Orlando, who has changed gender, will give way to questioning all gender issues at the beginning of the 20th century, because Orlando travels the entire journey from Elizabeth I to the beginning of the 20th century, transformed into a woman. He is what is called a time traveler, right? A globetrotter of eras. A time traveler?
From England, a time traveler, or a delicious coinage of the word and who at every moment suffers, yes, the neglect, right? The lambasting, which is being reviled, right? Treated less for being a woman, right? When he originally, was living a very quiet, very privileged life, being already looking to point out, right? And excuse me for interrupting you, but it's also your program, it's also my program. But precisely in these years, just to do this little note, it's the period between wars. Obviously, war is one of the things that most exacerbates this intention of man wanting to feel like, I'm the provider, I'm the one who goes, I kick my ass for my country. Big man, protect little woman. And I protect women, protect my children, and protect my land.
Have no feelings, I'm just action.
God, America. And a lot of it is like that, right? So this, in a somewhat unfortunate way, in a certain way, helps the spirit of the times become a bit sexist, right? So how refreshing it is to read Virginia Woolf at this time, when that ideology is at its peak, and she is also at her creative peak in this sense. Yes, quite a bit. It is one of her best periods. In fact, Orlando is considered one of her masterpieces, and also because there she knew how to question not only the gender role as a heterosexual woman, but also as a homosexual woman.
Because in that sense, Virginia Woolf, we must remember, she had an open sexuality, right? Her husband had everything, and he completely knew that she had encounters and love with other women. Right? And that helps us understand the dedication of this book, because she dedicates it to Vita Sackville West, who was her lover and confidant, right? Another writer too. And so, talking about this novel as a biography, as she subtitles it, also tells you about her own perception of life, right? About that freedom of love, about that projection of not only that you have to be heterosexual and that you like people of the opposite sex, right?
But it is openness in that sense, and also dialogue with her husband and with the other couples that she met and with whom she shared letters, love, time, space, and even dedicated novels to them, right? A great gift. So she paints a portrait through time to talk about and for us to understand the roaring 20s themselves, right? In this case in England, but also with many resources of how is that a person lives for so long transformed into a gender that was not originally theirs, right? So it is full of questions. And that is why this novel, this biography of Orlando, is considered the most brilliant work of fiction, right? Fiction, more or less. Yes, it is Virginia Woolf's fiction, right? And it continues to be taken up again. In fact, Jorge Luis Borges, the great Argentine writer, translated this work into Spanish. A little factoid. Take note.
But if on the one hand she made her criticism and her commentary through a fiction, a novel, an invented biography, Virginia Woolf also used to present the arguments to the face, right? To tell you, I can also say critical things, not only stories, novels, but also essays. And so she presents a room of one's own, or a room of one's own, where she reveals to us the evolution of feminist thought, but specifically in relation to literature. The book begins with the question, what do women need to write good novels? The answer, Virginia Woolf, as a character within her own essay, she will gradually present it, chew it over it, and argue it through visits she makes to the library and the impossibilities of reaching places of knowledge. She invents a combination of Cambridge and other universities. In other words, she also adds touches of fiction and is demonstrating that women can write well, and she is a living example of what you are reading. Of course. And the conclusion, the final conclusion, after 6 very good chapters, is one of the best essays I have ever read in my life because of its style, its theme, and its questioning. According to her, at that historical moment, for women to write good novels, they need economic and personal independence. In other words, a place of their own, a room of their own. Then there are references not only to the room of their own, which is like the conclusion. That is why the title is understood at the end, because she is emphasizing it as a space and also as a support, a roof, where you cannot fall dead, but rather work on your works and claim all your expressions and your feelings for a story, a fiction, but also there comes the mythical reference to Shakespeare's lost sister.
He doesn't ask himself how it could have happened. Let's imagine that Shakespeare's sister, William Shakespeare's, existed. She could have written the same way. The genius came from the family. She could have learned from her brother. The two of them could have collaborated. How could it have been possible for her to also become a reference in the language of English literature, right? And that's what he's betting on, right? The economic issue. The issue of having time and space for yourself, right? And he makes an appeal. At the end, right? He makes a statement and asks whoever is reading this, mainly women, that the best literature is yet to come because women are increasingly beginning. Let's remember the 1920s, to make their own, what they could always do, but for other reasons of money, time, space, roles, they haven't been allowed to, right? And it precisely, I want to emphasize, and every time I speak, that's it, right? The 20s are an era, right, of cultural flourishing, of ideological flourishing, and who are always looking to the future, right? And who are also always trying to get rid of the past a little, because the past, let's remember, we come from the First World War, everyone was devastated, economically, emotionally, and also collectively in many ways, right?
Even as a family, of course. So, Virginia Woolf, a parallel, right? Feminism with the future, feminism with literature, and feminism with fiction imagining, on the one hand, a man who changes sex, returns, and visits for long periods of time.
Now, many would be horrified how a man becomes a woman.
How is that? How is that? Here's the typical guy, right? But these two books, if you want to get into Virginia Woolf, if you haven't already, I also highly recommend her. She is one of the best writers in English and probably in history. Together with Mary Shelley, they are some of the greatest references in the English language. Spanish is there. They were swarming in the 1920s. Here, it's the same as in Argentina. I'll put it very simply and clearly. In the 1920s, both in Mexico and Argentina, there were groups that were supposedly opposed to the way they viewed literature and therefore wrote. In Mexico, on the one hand, there were the estudiantistas who began in 1921 and ended around 1927, but they continued working on their own, right? Loosely. We can mention Manuel Mapes Sarce, who Vedavila, Germán, Larcid, and many magazines where they published. What did they want? What did the estudiantistas want? They said,
You tell me.
They said, to hell with the past, to hell with the classical academic tradition. Let's do it with what we have here, with the machines, with the violence of time passing quickly with technology. But they also claim very, very Mexican reasons and motives, as they even end up saying in one of their manifestos, long live turkey mole. So it's like the perfect combination between the speed of the technology of the Mexican Revolution and also recovering the best, proposing new things, innovating, but with well-located roots that go against academia, right? Mexican roots with references to places, but also to food, right? Right? I think gastronomy, one of the best in the world, Mexico, right? Well, they had to take that into account because they are astute, right? And above all, their literature was for workers, right? They were very aware of the issue, not only of the Mexican Revolution as an attempt at innovation, but also the great reference, that red beacon that was the Soviet Revolution, right? The October Revolution happened in 1917, but the Soviet Union was founded in the 1920s, right? So you see that country in the distance trying different things, right? In its origins. It was coined, and they also wanted to incorporate it into their poetry, into their novels, mainly poetry and novels, right? The way they presented their ideas to the public was by putting up posters, right? In the Zócalo of Puebla, they put up the second loud one, being loud with the resources they had, right? As workers, as publications, very, very visible to the public. Whether they understand it or not, whether they receive it or not, whether it is open, right? The square is more populated or not. Germán Lezarzubide was from Puebla, right? In that sense, you understand why the name, right? When we start talking about those that end in isms, you'll see more later as I understand it, but they're always guided by the preceding word that is stridency, right? Ares. Stridency what? Revolutionary, popular stridency, worker stridency,
A lot of noise, few nuts.
and breaking, the academy. Making fun of the great references. Somewhere in one of the two manifestos, I think in the first one, they send Ignacio Zaragoza, that is, national heroes. National heroes.
Chopin to the electric chair.
And they also say that about Chopin to the electric chair. So, classical music, those bronze heroes apparently had been dead for a long time. Well then, let them go back to the electric chair of history for the stridentists. That's how it was, right? Yes. That was one side, right? The stridentists with all this boom, this electricity, right? Very Mexican. On the other hand, there were their contemporaries who were more refined, more cosmopolitan, right?
More PAM members. In many cases, there was no way to compare them, but that's how I
put it. But the interesting thing about this is that they were more into theater, for example. They were more into more classical poetry, but they used world references, right? Authors who were there could be Carlos Pellicer, right? Chateau Respodet and José Gorostiza, the author of Muerte Sin Fin, which is one of the most powerful poems in all of Mexican literature and in the world because of the
planet Earth, hell
of the universe, because I mentioned it in one of the past episodes, right? It's like looking at a glass and seeing how you can't reach that glass, and because it has water, it reveals everything to you, right? And at the same time, it's unreachable. I mentioned it in the Alejandro Pisonic episode, to be precise, which will appear here somewhere, and in the description of this video. But what I'm trying to say then with the contemporaries is that we have a much more worldly approach, much more of combining issues from France, combining issues from the Mexican classics, but very classics like Sor Juana and others. And finally, well, it's understandable how they didn't get along, at least in their proposals, because while some wanted to break with all tradition and bring technology and revolution to literature, the others wanted to integrate the old and the new contemporary. Yerone, that's why they were called contemporaries, right? It's contemporary with the world. And both are very valuable because both read each other at the same time and because both flourished in the 1920s of the last century, right?
in Mexico.
In Mexico specifically. Those are the ones that happen in Mexico, that opposition, stridentists and contemporaries. But in Argentina, a similar phenomenon happened, right? Which is the Boedo group and the Florida group. Why Boedo and why Florida? Because they met on the respective streets of those names, right? Now they were like their literary gangs. Exactly. Now, the Boedo group could be said to have been the Argentine stridentists. Why? Because it was militant literature, right? Working class literature of, I'm going to write this story where things went to hell for me in the workshop I work in, or I went kid in the workshop I work in, whatever. So I can tell you about this experience. I can't reveal these shortcomings of social and working class organization. Argentina, what about?
The lack of money. The lack of money, you don't have any money. And in that sense, the most representative of the Boedo group is Roberto Art. He's like the opposite side, Jorge Luis Borges, because his writing is unrevised. Writing that some people called him lacking style, that was careless, but in reality, what he did was be crude, right? I followed the school of being crude. Being crude, being rough.
Because I followed the school of Dostoevsky of passion, being what matters to reflect in these heartbreaking stories of those from the underground, as the Argentines would say in this case. And therefore, they also later said that it was proletarian literature, right? The Argentine stridentists are the ones from Boedo, right? Okay. Now, there are issues like labor exploitation. As I mentioned, the mechanization of man as a product of the modern world. That is to say, the horrible part of the modernization of the 1920s, at least in Argentina, which also became a reference like from the refrigeration of meat. They became the meat warehouse for the world, mainly for England. So who did that? Who suffered that horrible part? The Argentines, the workers, the laborers, right? The comrades. And Boedo was capturing that, right? Boedo's group, mainly with Roberto Artaolla. Now, on the other hand, there were the Argentine contemporaries, who are the group from Florida, They had the avant-garde, cosmopolitan, contemporary spirit of, we are from here, from all over the world. Because they wanted to renew the language, they focused more on form, not content, although they had good content. They also drew on avant-garde references from Europe, right? The isms that would be taken up again, and they wanted to modernize Argentina in that sense. They wanted to make it first world, right? With this bonanza that on the one hand produced the bad, the proletarian industrialization, they wanted to take the pretty part, right? The elegant part. And it can be understood that although they bring in the avant-garde, they bring in Joyce, the Spanish, they are influenced by Paris, by England in general. Well, they are antagonistic, right? So Argentina has to remember that Boedo, a proletarian worker, Roberto La Madre, is seeing that.
And in the case of Florida, innovation, avant-garde. Define the Argentine W. Can. And who was the greatest representative?
I got it. Everything is wrong. Who was Florida's reference, the one who continued producing and always sought to be like that in the world? With many nuances, but it is Jorge Luis Borges. So, if you read Roberto and Jorge Luis Borges, you will find that they are side A and side B of what? Of the 1920s in Argentine literature, right? Of the 1920s of the last century and also the 1920s of this moment, right? Let's jump back into the pond. Because this literature also happened in the 1920s, in 1927, with the generation of that same year in Spain, okay? The worst of the generation of 27 in Spain had the characteristic of being a constant, very bold, very brave use of metaphor and of new words created in order to convey very intense emotions that we all have, but didn't know how to convey until the 1920s. Now, language 2, basically language 2 in the generation of 27. Language 27. In that sense, the most famous poet, there were quite a few, who were participating in this generation of 27, but the obligatory reference here, the greatest is Federico Garcia Lorca.
He published many works, despite having been brutally murdered and betrayed by those who were against the Republic, right? Then came the revolution, the Spanish Civil War. He was one of the first victims. But what you have to see is his poetry, remembering the generation of 27, how he saved the Spanish language on the other side of the pond, which is, I'll read to you. It probably sounds familiar to you already, but it's always worth listening to again. It's called a fragment only because it's a bit long, a sleepwalking romance. Green that I love you, green. Green wind, green branches. The ship on the sea and the horse on the mountain. With the shadow at her waist, she dreams on her veranda. Green flesh, green hair, with eyes of cold silver. Green that I love you, green. Under the gypsy moon. Things are looking at her, and she can't look at 'em. Lorca will have two paths. Basically, this one is to recover the tradition of what? Of the gypsies, of movement, of being globetrotters with these songs. Right? This musicality. He will also have a very surrealist part, but that comes later when he takes a trip to New York, which in fact that other poetry book is called Poet in New York. But the important thing about the 1920s is the gypsy ballad, where this sleepwalking ballad with the green that I want to see you, with a lot of musicality, very, very attached to that journey, right? But on the other hand, there were also women in this generation of 27 who have been recovered as the without a hat, who were the golden generation. The sin sombrero.
Why were they the golden generation of women in Spain at that time? Because they hardly appeared in textbooks, but they have been recovered as they should have always been there. They were educated, committed to art, to culture. And they took off the hats that people, especially women, had to wear so much in the 1920s to be rebellious. And they
took off their hats. Exactly. They took off their hats to be modern themselves. So obviously they did not follow the model of what a woman should be, right? and in the midst of a macho society that is always going to cause a stir. I just want to mention one. There are several, but this one seems very striking to me. It has a very interesting story. If you want, you can have your own radio madness. Her name is Maria Teresa León. The poem is called Song of the Empty Moon. Be silent, my love. Do not scream. Do not cry. Do not be afraid of the dark night. Do not cling to me with the tremors of someone who has seen a lion in the thicket and is frightened by its shining eyes. And dream of the golden angel. Sleep. Sleep, my child, having a heart made of tenderness. In the stanzas, more sweetness passes, more sweetness passes. A lullaby that rhymed with affection. The voice no longer resonates, calming the fears of the son. That is his sorrow. That God took his loves to heaven this Christmas Eve. The child's terror no longer calms on the dark night. That the blinding rose took the rose from the blooming rose bush, from the blooming rose bush. The relentless scythe that blinds both good and evil unseen, that when cutting the bud it withered the rose bush. In this specific poem, there are also references, like Garcia Lorca has, to something very, very significant about the generation of 27, which is the moon, the question of sowing and reaping. In the generation of 27, there will be those natural references, but with a musicality that will blow your mind. Man, no, that will blow your mind.
So Maria Teresa León? Maria Teresa León.
Censored.
What did she do? Censored a lot. My podcast partner. A little bit of poker. Poker words. Now, Federico Garcia Lorca generation of 27 and Maria Teresa León. It's a time when in Spain, Spanish was literally revived to sing, to feel, to be rebellious, right? Let's remember, for example, that Garcia Lorca was homosexual, right? There's also that vindication. He has some sonnets called Dark Love that are really bad, if you'll pardon the expression. And of course,
Professor, go ahead.
allow me to curse. It's been a while since I didn't say any strong words or rude words. I couldn't say I'm homosexual. Okay. Now, Maria Teresa León, well, I'll tell you, has a very interesting life. Ended up visiting the Soviet Union. She saved works of art during the Spanish Civil War. She almost grabbed Guernica and took it away so that Francisco Franco, that son of a dictator, wouldn't keep it, right? So, very interesting. To finish off the literature, so his realism. I just want to mention two things about his realism, Manifesto 2. Manifesto 1 and Manifesto 2, both by André Breton, right? The first one, the important thing, which is long, but the important thing is that there he defined what surrealism was. He says, pure psychic automatism, whose means is to attempt to express verbally, in writing or in any other way, the real functioning of thought. It is a dictation of thought without the regulatory intervention of reason, unrelated to any aesthetic or moral concern. Therefore, this first manifesto focuses on aesthetic and artistic aspects. How should the engine of surrealism work? It is with that unconscious part, right, that we have more or less already internalized, never rather, because several years have passed, and that is where it is established, right? What is important of the dreams, what is important of the fantasies, reason does not have to intervene. Manifesto 1 is that. 2 is the most political and social thing that has been written on the face of France, because there Breton advocated combining surrealism, what he had said about not intervening reason, whatever that means in this second context, with the Marxist revolution and with the search to establish a socialist, communist society. Although paradoxes of life, he later, years after publishing this second manifesto, he would be expelled from the Communist Party. So, I'm saying it very broadly. More or less, we're all already steeped in surrealism as well as in psychoanalysis in terms of words, in education, in human formation. But remember two things about surrealism in literature as a proposal, and that later spread to all the arts, to all other human manifestations of art, which is that reason should not intervene. And for the time being, surrealism in the 1920s eventually became very, very political and revolutionary and rebellious, so much so that they themselves dismissed surrealism and included themselves, and suddenly they were no longer together, but they wanted the revolution. But as always, those of us who wanted to change things ended up fighting. This is the literature of the crazy 20s. It is a total explosion of revolutionary, avant-garde, proletarian issues that recover history, but also deny it, that want to go beyond reason, right? Conquer dreams, and that everything that exploded in the 20s continues to explode in this time, in other projections, right? In other registers, in other arts, video games, as I was saying, right? Also programming. The IAS, of course, that explosion is also happening there. Many explosions, but that would be, very broadly speaking, the small but atomic explosion of the literature of the Roaring 20s.
And that is super recoverable, right? Precisely the fact that it is so plural, right? Yes, it is. And that is something that we are going to rescue throughout the episode, which is that it is so plural and at the same time so individualistic and at the same time so collective, right? I mean, this is an era full of contradictions. It is an era that, coming from the First World War, just coming out of the First World War, that is the point I am getting at, right? All the time we are going to find these contradictions, and this is a bit what we want you listeners to take into account with all of these, because in terms of art, there are pluralities, because suddenly the world becomes a world of peace, let's say, after the catastrophe. In the aftermath, they would say in English,
Sure.
from all the destruction, and now people just want to feel free. They want to express things, and some express literally the first thing that comes to mind, right? And some are much more thoughtful, and also something like the contemporaries or those from Florida, a little more elaborate, more refined, also following traditions, but always with an eye to the future. Almost everyone was looking to the future because they didn't know and didn't want to look to the past. They didn't know how to see the past, of course. That's right. And going into the subject a little bit, that's how we get to music. The music of the Roaring 20s, which begins, obviously, with the father or mother of all the music of that era in the 19th century, the end of the 19th century. Like, damn it, the blues, which is the father or mother of jazz, whatever you want to call it. He was doing something very mainstream at the time, something very ironic, because it was music that white people liked, that came from the suffering of African American people. No. But, well, more on that in a moment. This was becoming mainstream a little bit before the 2000s. Well, before the 2000s. 1920, right? A little before this decade. We have to review, obviously, that this was always the blues. It always was and will continue to be in a certain way, with its downsides. Never better said. The relevance of protest music, right? Of course. Of laments that were made music to protest through homing, which is also used as a cryptic language. I don't know if you knew this, and if you didn't, you're going to find out right now. Certain songs, as well as there are dances and there are these African drum beats of African music that say something like, "From there comes a lion," and this one is getting dark, there's no food, bastard, bring something home, son of a... Yes, all those things were also communicated through drums that could obviously travel kilometers away, right? So, black culture from the roots of Africa brings a lot of culture and language through music, right? So the blues is something that was already being established at that time. And, well, ironically, as I was saying, it's something that white people applaud a lot, right? Damn it. Damn racism. Through all this, it emerged as the only thing they had left. Because it was taken from them, let's not talk about sad things right now, but they were obviously living under a yoke. That slavery had already been abolished by then, but obviously the remnants of so much mistreatment, it was becoming too much for black culture at that time, right? Negan. So we talk about this simply as a small glimpse of what was to come, because obviously, the music of the 1920s, at least the United States, and that's where it also became globalized, was Yask, on the other hand, has a frenetic, wild, doomed, strident sound, right? People were also eager to dance, to communicate in different ways, right? Why? Because they had been locked up in their homes, watching their neighbors being killed, suffering from hunger, right? It has to be said, with all its cursed lyrics, they were at war, right? Working overtime. Yes, of course. Yes, of course. So, many relatives died. Anyway, no. Jazz music means liberation in terms of sound and also of the body, of dance, right? The musicians, I don't know if you knew, dear radio listeners, but jazz musicians in the beginning, in the 1920s, perhaps a little earlier too, were musicians that while they played, they crowed like roosters. Wow, how cool. They whinnied like horses. Very good. They pretended to have hiccups with the saxophone, or even made them laugh like trumpets, which we already have. A little more like with Charlie Brown and these things. We have it a little more in the, sure. In the collective memory. In the collective, right? So, these sounds were evidently something like rock or reggaeton in recent times, right? Like people here are already old-fashioned with a few wrinkles around their eyes and faces. They said, this music of kids, I mean, how do they start dancing here together, right? Like they want to procreate right now, right? Right. How disgusting.
Like they're going to be making love in a dance hall.
Yeah. Well, although jazz was being popularized at the beginning of the century, in the 1920s, combined with the political climate and spirit of the times, it became more irreverent than ever and was cool for the kids, right? Like the coolest thing. It wasn't punk, it's just that this guy plays jazz, right?
Yeah.
A jazz cat like in the Aristocats.
Exactly. It's that idea of if you're on the wrong track, you like jazz. In the 1920s?
This was the musical genre that represented freedom, and after, everyone was really embarrassed by the war, as I've already said, right? Through frenetic dancing and visual outrage, because it was like you could move your legs however you wanted and everything. A little bit, well, yes, it was more like contemporary dance, which, well, they perceived it perhaps as contemporary dance. More liberated, the body. People celebrated this freedom that they obviously hadn't had during the war, and obviously this peace that they hadn't had during the war. Unfortunately, this will last less than a decade, but we'll see about that, right? Yorikeya. As they say, no one can take away what you've danced, right? No one can take away what you've danced. Then as for music, also as for literature, but as for music, let's talk a little bit about the Harlem Renaissance, which is the matrix of contemporary music, which we can literally talk about as rock, jazz, rock and jazz, at least at the moment. Plus, it also draws heavily from this as a contemporary. But in the 20s, obviously, and it's also a flourishing of black literature, right? Which is something that I would also like to contribute to the literature section. And as for music, well, this basically became the soundtrack, right? That's where Charleston comes from and everything, which I'll talk to you about in a little more detail in a moment. Don't leave. Subscribe to this channel. So we have these guys who were going to dance to jazz, right? At that time, it was like chatting. Let's chat. What's up with a chat? And now, like you see the guys here, stuck to the wall. And, oh, yeah. Down to the floor. That ass is mine. I already have the papers. Well, they did that, but neighing like horses and pretending to hiccup with the trumpets, right? It was something that was seen as the craziest thing, right? That guy's steps are wrong, that guy. No, he dances the Charleston. Guy dances the Charleston, right? It's like having tattoos on your face. At that time. And we're talking a little bit more about the Charleston to finish with this mainstream thing, let's say, because the Charleston seems like I'm only talking about the United States, but in reality it was a global feeling. It should also be said that at other times, in other places, culture wasn't as developed after the war, right? The United States is one of those that rose quickly, let's say, because who knows? Maybe because they weren't beaten up like other places, but anyway. The Charleston, popularized in 1923, in the musical Running Wild, which is unusually, very unusual for the time, because part of the cast was African American, right? And people were like, oh my God, how are there going to be black people here? No, obviously white people. Yeah, of course, just as a footnote, I just saw that Morgan Freeman. Okay. This guy asks him, how are we going to end racism and everything? And that guy tells his interviewer, stop talking about it. Let it go. Yeah. Well, as we know, all traditions originating in Africa are quite collectivist, right? Of course. And it's fair to say that it's a bit ironic that many of them became one of the first phenomena of cultural appropriation, because the image we have of Charlestoni is of the flappers, right? These girls in high heels with big headdresses, I don't know what you call them, and very strident hairstyles for the time, dancing crazy. But they're, I don't mean it in the worst sense, but rather like cabaret dancers, a bit mocking. That's the aesthetic. It's the aesthetic, right?
Because they also carried their cigarettes with cigarette holders, right? Quite shiny.
Check out Peaky Blinders. If you've seen Peaky Blinders, it's part of everything we're talking about. It just occurred to me that you should also watch Selledge by Woody Allen. There you will see very clearly all this aesthetic of the 20s. Also pointing out with this small story, we can say that Charleston practically had the same origin as the same reception that in our times is comparable, evidently, to trap, perreo, reggaeton, to urban music. People who were a little more experienced in life and a little more stale in spirit and body thought it was an immoral dance, that it only seemed like they were alienated by the damned rhythms, and almost it was a dance of the devil to make you fall into the temptation of making respectable ladies and elegant gentlemen want to tell you, in a way that is not friendly to the Bible, that they would love to have bodily intercourse and a mixture of fluids. And now we are going to do something that is very important to me, and for me it is a real delight to bring it to the radio listeners, the C of cacophony. C decaphony. Dodecaphony. I've already said this 4 times. Is the part that's been buried in history, right? Because, well, obviously if you listen, if you study musicology, if you're a musician, if you like all these topics about people who are into music, you'll know what dodecaphony, tonality, and all that are, but normally you don't hear that, right? And that was something that wasn't heard at that time. That, contrary to what many people understand, dodecaphony is different from tonalism, but I'm going to tell you in a very simple way what dodecaphony is. It's basically ensuring that in a piece of music, the 12 musical notes are played with almost the same frequency. This gives rise to a new approach to the emerging sensibilities of that time, right? So if I play C, I have to play the other 11 notes before playing the same C again or any other C. It's also a matter of intellectualizing the creative process of making music, right? What I want to highlight about the Roaring 20s is that people were looking for different ways to relate to art through art and reality itself, right? Of course. Contrary to what many people believe, right? Arnold Schoenberg was the first to create 12-tone music. He became the greatest exponent, but it was first devised by Joseph Matthias Hauer, an Austrian, who published a book called The Law of 12 Tones. As I said, Schoenberg is one of the people you'll find most about 12-tone music and even atonality, which is simply making music almost as it is, right? Quickly faded away. Yes. All this is comparable to the new avant-garde movements that we have now, right? A bit like what you were talking about earlier about Jordi Grip, right? Music that is not being made for the mainstream, but that many people are also connecting with precisely because of what they would call the 1% law, right?
No. Being
able to connect with an idea so unique that it ends up belonging to everyone, right? Something like Brad Summers.
Like being a rare bird, they would say in Latin, right?
Yeah. Okay. So what with being able to find crazy combinations, we are getting married right now, right? Because more or less in the 20s, they were trying to find new ways of doing things. We also feel and are a little bit stuck there because we say there's nothing new anymore, right? And that's why there are all these things and these isms. Isms, I mean, surrealism, trends, right? Obviously, we'll talk a little more about the mouse, but anyway, this is about music Everyone was pretty crazy, Rimi. There were people who were wanting to use all the musical notes in the same beat at the same time. And then there were these people who were literally using dance as a form of liberation, both sexual and artistic, as an expression. And that's a bit of what we can say about music in the broad strokes of what was happening in the 20s. And that will become something recurrent throughout all the things we're going to talk about, because there's a reason they're called the freaking Roaring 20s. Set to music, so of course.
Now, about cinema. Cinema in the 20s is also a world that's always waiting to be explored. But let me tell you the main keys. One is German Expressionism, okay? Another is the obligatory reference to editing, which was discovered that cinema can be edited in different ways to be more attractive. Oh, we can edit. Videos can be edited like this one that is being recorded. That's right. And finally, I would like to mention the great of Charlie Chaplin, right? And I would also like to talk about a key figure, which is the leap from silent film to sound film. Also, the creation of Mickey Mouse
Was in those years. And something from the Soviet Union that was seeing cinema as a documenting of the changes in the cities of the new Soviet reality, and there will also be surrealism. In cinema, okay, these are the keys. Yes.
When we talk about surrealism in cinema, we are talking about El Cien Andalú, which is that film that Salvador made. I read it together with Luis Buñuel, where, at the time of being projected, the scenes have no connection with each other, there's no reason, but associations of images. The most iconic scene is an eye that is opened with a razor blade. I was going to
Say a cloud, but yes, precisely.
because of a sharp cloud, the surrealists would say. And it's a very, very short film, and where these two geniuses of surrealism participate, right? This film came out almost at the end of the 20s, right? Then, when we talk about cinema, which is the Soviet issue that I'm talking about, documentaries that really capture not stories that are based on literature, not stories that are based on theater, but rather portray the world as it is. That's Bertov Cinema, the creator of this revolutionary idea from the Soviet Union, which is to record crafts, record everyday life, record music, and also do magic with editing, with montage, but very, very proletarian, very involved in the working class issue.
Honey too, right?
Very much about being a damn gossip. Cinema.
Gossip. Being a gossip of the city, right? Of urban changes. The reference to Mickey Mouse is, therefore, the entrance of the cartoons, right? The entrance to cartoons, the entrance to the most powerful thing that is wonder. Remember, it always amazes me every time I remember that something that is written on paper can be seen in motion. Is absolute magic? Yes.
That thing deserves 10,000 episodes. And analysis of what's up with animation. Right? What was up with animation? What was up with the Mickey Mouse animation that his movie Steamboat Willie, or The Steamboat, was released in 1928, right? Where he is driving his little boat, and there is Minnie, and there is a typical problem of Leo, who has to save Minnie and free himself to be the captain of the ship. That is what is told in that short film, Steamboat Willie, right? Or Steamboat Willie from 1928. Also, the jump, this is key, right? Not very, very important from silent film to sound film. The problem was not that they could not put music-y. In fact, it already happened in silent films by Charlie Chaplin, for example. I'll talk a little more about him later. But there was music that was often composed by Charlie Chaplin or a musician in charge. But the hard part was matching what you're hearing right now, which is that my mouth can be heard at the same time as it moves on the recording.
An absolute aberration of nature? In the crazy 20s, that was, look, a very difficult thing until 1927, when the jazz singer was released. That's why Among other things, it's the great film that marked the leap from silent to silent film. There's very little dialogue, but they were able to synchronize it, and the interesting thing that it also coincides with what? With jazz, right? The film where dialogue is finally heard. The film
sung for you. Yes, well, that's it. This leap from silent film to sound film with the music of those years, right? Or yeah, everything was there, tying in very, very well in the film, which is always paired with the music, right? And if at that moment it was jazz, then jazz is going to play, and that's what the movie's going to sing, and that's it, my brother. We're going to sing in this song from 1927, That movie's also very criticized because they make,
I love it. I love the smack. I love it. They make quite a few racist references, like putting makeup on a white actor's face for the children of.
Yeah. Well, anyway, horrible things happen too, obviously.
Yes, we have to remember that in the 1920s, people weren't any more intelligent than in the 1910s, which was also a time of wars, revolutions, and killings and all that, right? They were just a little calmer. They were calmer, and they had more tools, more technology. For better or worse, but the stagnant thoughts like rotten water were still there, and in fact, they will continue to be.
Fewer and fewer. But those ideas can be visited for better or worse.
Well, I'm talking about the 30s, which also.
Okay, 1930, but I was talking about the crazy years of the 21st century. I was talking about the crazy years. Look. Well, everyone is talking about their own radio madness in this episode. Charles Chaplin. Here. Charles Chaplin. That scene where he takes out a little bread and sticks a fork in it and does it like this is from the movie The Gold Rush. Or rather, The Gold Rush, where, my precious little pig from Radio Madness. Give it a name in the comments. It would be great if you could give this kind naked gentleman a name. No. That scene of dancing with the bread, which is also recreated in The Simpsons later, iconic. In silent cinema, comes out in the 20s, in the movie The Gold Rush of 25. That movie tells how the gold rush is revived now. Gonna look for gold, gonna
look for it all the way to Alaska, right? And there goes the character of Charles Chaplin, right? The typical Charlotte has its message, right? It has its moral, like many of Chaplin's films. Comedy with a well thought out message, well scored. He made his own music, he acted, directed, and everything. In the 1920s, Chaplin is the cinema. The god.
Is the god on the screen, but he is in his films, right? There is the eternal
cosplay of being. When you have a lot of money, like in the episode of Grimes, which we will leave here, who is an extraterrestrial person. But returning to Charles Chaplin, who was a very earthly person, very earthly, he is the key figure of the cinema of the 1920s. Although he did not make a talking film until several years later, after the 1920s, he did not do it with the film The Great Dictator, but that is another matter. From another decade, and in this episode of the 20s, we don't give a damn. We don't give a damn.
Also, another Charles Chaplin film that came out in the 20s, 1921, very iconic, is The Kid. The Kid, the boy, the kid, or the kid, depending on where it was translated. And that you have it.
And that you have it. Because that film is key because it begins the 20s with Charlie Chaplin rescuing a child who is abandoned, and they share that same misery but with happiness. He seeks to make his life happy, and love flourishes, and it is very melodramatic but also full of iconic moments from silent cinema and from Charlie Chaplin's cinema. Well, now, Will Smith did it better in The Pursuit of Happiness, honestly. Okay. True. But that's where that type of film was born. Will Smith was born. Born short. George Chauvin is the key to 20s cinema, where there are melodramas. There are comedies, but with message. Satires, mockery with that character who is the most insignificant, the most futile of society, a vagabond. And from there, criticize everything. That of the gold rush, which is the fever for that material, for wealth and so on, for poverty, which is the neglect of children, which also happened, of course, after World War I. but also happened in the roaring 20s, right? That poverty that Chaplin didn't want to see, he also put it on the screen, right? As happens in many of the critical films from the roaring 20s of this century. A true artist, that Mr. Chaplin. Chaplin, without a doubt, a great, great figure in the arts of the century. He could have his own hour of madness if you leave it there. I just say, leave it there in the comments and we'll consider it. And another mythical scene from silent cinema is Harold Lloyd hanging from a clock on top of a building. The film Safety Last, or The Man-Fly, from 23rd of January, 1923. They will then take up that reference again in Back to the Future, right? Hey, the question of time hanging from a clock. That's where it comes from. That's where that iconic question comes from, just so you're clear, of hanging from a clock, right? In cinema. That movie is desperate as hell. That movie is very desperate, but also very beautiful, and it ends with a kiss and a man losing his shoes. Watch it, it's also very good. It's available. Spoiler alert, he loses his shoe.
He loses his shoe, but he gains in love. Understand it however you want. The issue of editing comes, but from the other side of the world, which is the Soviet Union, because with the movie Battleship Potemkin, Stanstein makes a montage where, through a tragedy that is a crowd being attacked, a stroller is set free with a baby because the mother is killed. And the stroller falls and falls and falls and falls for long minutes. Even though it's just a moment that in real life would last a long time, little by little. Thanks to the editing, we see the reactions, the deaths, right? The tragedy of this cruel attack, right? It recreates a historical event in Russia that was still sartorial, right? Then the editing reveals the possibilities of editing, putting back, removing parts. For example, in this part, I could edit and remove my hand and things like that, right? The cynic.
What's more, edit, man? Look, my hand is here, and now it appears here.
In fact, you could put me in reverse and all that kind of thing. That's where it comes from the Roaring 20s, also from the Soviet Union, right? Stein, right? It's very important to consider that it's not the same to be shown something one after the other than to have cuts and interference from other images to make your head go crazy with the cinema of attractions, right? With the cinema that really touches you to the core, with these editing interventions. Finally, or rather the first thing I mentioned, but to close the film, is the question of German Expressionism. German Expressionism could have its own episodes as well. But I just want you to remember that what they were looking for in those films from the Roaring 20s, but in Germany, was to revive the issue of monsters. They invented science fiction cinema. And of course, the idea of the vampire specifically. The vampire in cinema is founded with Nosferatu in the 20s, a German expressionist film that referenced that to this day they keep putting in vampire films here and there and there.
Edward Cullen, for example, with Twilight, is from the Roaring 20s. The issue of a madman who makes a golem, which is the cabinet of Dr. Caligari, of a mad scientist who creates many things, and then suddenly he is killing people and everything is fine, and I don't know what. That comes from the Roaring 20s in cinema. Okay. And also Metropolis, which is the great science fiction masterpiece of German Expressionism, where there is a dystopian society, right? Where there are workers living underground and robots in control, and there is a position. Love will triumph, but there will also be a change of those below taking power. That domination, also much of German Expressionism, so you can see prefigured what ended up happening with the arrival of the Austrian man with the little mustache to power in Germany several decades later, right? Mother. So German Expressionism, as a finishing touch in European cinema, is nightmares ahead of its time. They are also seeing the future. This cinema of the Roaring 20s, of what is going to happen in the Roaring 20s, while they are no longer roaring, of the miserable 30s, in Germany itself and in the world. So there is also a lot of diversity in cinema, from Chaplin, German speciesism, the leap from silent film to sound film, that connection with editing, so that you can transmit edits, that you can include different scenes and cuts and so on. all that is exploding in the roaring 20s of cinema, which can also be seen in our time with things like, for example, creating actors entirely by computer. Artificial intelligences that write the scripts, right? That's why there was a strike last year, right? This chaos. So we also have the roaring 20s in our century with those revolutions of how cinema is prefiguring the nightmares of the future of this century itself, from those who work in cinema to what is being told in cinema, right? Perhaps it is too early to tell, but at least until 2024, there are those coincidences, right?
Meef. So the cinema of the Roaring Twenties is a revolutionary cinema, very gossipy, very eager to get involved in the production of the torrent of images, and also in the content of portraying monsters that seem very inhuman, but are totally the reality of many people. Like in German Expressionism and like what Charles Chaplin portrays through comedy and the absurd and his little bread dance, right? So we could go on, but cinema, those are the images that we want to recover, that small, great universe that is also revolutionary, diverse, comical, annoying, and very, very crazy in Europe and in America too.
This summer. And now let's move on to the section on isms and graphics. Graphics have a lot to do with this little school, which in fact was like a school. It was like a school, but it was, let me find the word. In German, to tell you. Well, while my partner gets a little lost in the little, he's flirting with his own script. Let me tell you to drink some water, to stay hydrated in these crazy 20s, and we really appreciate it if you leave your like, your comment, and subscribe to Radio Madness. Well, I couldn't find it right now, but let's talk about what Bauhaus is, and why the hell should we care even a little bit. Bauhaus means construction house. This is what it means, in a very descriptive, historical way, since the establishment was like a school that mixed art and industry, something like trying to give functionality to art and at the same time give artistic beauty to marketable expressions. If this starts to sound familiar, it's clearly the marketing and propaganda that we live with today. Design marketing or propaganda as we know it, or industrial design or graphic design would not exist if it hadn't been for Bauhaus, at least as a great exponent, right? If it hadn't been, this is precisely the word I was looking for, an anti-academic institution, because what it sought, yes, true, was to grasp almost without wanting to, almost without making sacred the knowledge of art, but simply to apply it and to be able to go beyond its own limits, which it had. You're redundant, delimited so far, right? Giving functionality to beauty, giving beauty to functionality is a bit of what we have to know. That, well, in a certain way, architecture had been doing it for maybe 3,000 years, but it had not occurred to people that they could do it in another way. That is the revolution in the 20s with the Bauhaus, which we can quickly talk about its importance as a founding pillar of design, the concept of living also in architecture, visual communication and advertising, and also those issues that took a turn that would make the different idea of what propaganda is resonate to this day, and in this case also social networks. How they brainwash you also has a lot to do with the Bauhaus, not because they did it directly, but because visually they were too much power, they gave too much power to humanity. Like, yes, if you only use a giant circle to say this is a warning of something, those guys for the first time said, we can do it in an almost commercial way, right? So a
massive one so that everyone receives it and has it.
Something like that, like the functional spaces of your own home also, because of the architecture, which we won't go into that much, but in the architecture also ironically made by an architect at the Bauhaus. Ironically, it didn't have architecture. at the beginning. That was until later. But, well, that also happened in the 20s, but the Bauhaus is also a whole other thing. It's another thing that we're not going to get into, but that's the important thing for you to know. Beauty, functionality, propaganda, advertising, all that started to happen here, right? And obviously it evolved step by step in the future, right? Well, I don't know if you're going to say it, but that was the reason why, when the Nazis arrived, they closed that school. Because it's like they were teaching what we were going to use now in the 30s to annihilate half of Europe. Why not? Envious. Yes. Mexican. Envious. Well, let's go now to the graphic and plastic arts in Mexico, which was something very badass. It's something that I didn't fully understand, and I want to share it with you today, the damned Mexican moralism and how it revolutionized all this. It would reach its peak in another decade, but it's important to recognize that it's in this era of the 20s, in these crazy 20s, where all this cinema is, the cinema of Eisenstein, where Cesar Vallejo is, where all the literature of Virginia Woolf is happening, where the Bauhaus thing is happening, where all the surrealism, futurism, jazz, everything jazz, all this that we've talked about here in Mexico was also happening, right? The Estrientistas, of course. While all this was happening, in this decade, three perfect sons were representing the visual and cultural movement worldwide with Mexican Marinism. Of course, I'm talking about the very unpopular Diego Rivera, better known as the Dude, the 500 pesos. The guy who's on the 500 pesos. He wasn't on it. I know that people are intelligent and they know how to read through my the painting toad, well, that guy David Alfaro Siqueiros, and Jose Clemente Orozco, who you've probably heard of, at least by accident, right? They took themes from the recent Mexican Revolution, something that was revolutionary at that time, not only in Mexico, but worldwide, taking something that had just happened politically and using it, as you'll see, even for government propaganda. The mestizo identity, which was something important to recover in Mexico, and the history of Mesoamerican culture, which right now may sound like, well, obviously, dude, the coins have the Aztec calendar in this thing, right? The sunstone, by the way. But the muralists cultivated those ways of expressing themselves in that decade. Yes. They planted them, right? So that we could have the honey, the aguamiel. The aguamiel? Yes. Of the pre-Hispanic culture represented, also representing Mexico. Iconically, of course, that was important for Mexico in political terms because for the first time, artists were, as I have already said, contributing to the proliferation of official government discourses, also forming part of the official publicity of the state, and, redundantly, the whole conglomeration of ideas that were beginning to prevail in the new Mexican government were made public. The recovery of pride in indigenous aesthetics and ideology as part of the national identity in art, and also trying to build bridges between all this pre-Hispanic history and modernity at that time, which, it must be said, was very explosive, very pluralistic throughout the world, and also in Mexico, right? Of course. Diego Rivera and all of them were, well, especially Diego Rivera, yes, the hard fact, he was also a friend of Andrés Breton, the first guy to write the first Surrealist Manifesto, and then the second, and also a friend of Leon Trotsky, Law, right? So the Soviet revolutionary guy, the guy was a high-ranking official, right? I mean, the guy knew what was going on elsewhere. He was
among big fleas, that toad. He was up to no good. He was
on drugs. Probably two, right? I don't know, but anyway, let's say that following the tenor of the artistic interventions of the time worldwide, of which I was already very steeped, at least Diego Rivera and Conocidos, let's say, yes, art was beginning to be seen as a truly powerful mechanism of soft power, which, for those who don't know, hard power is coming and killing people, burning their crops, and colonizing, and by colonizing and doing. And soft power is, well, here I go with my music, right? Well, I'll throw on K-pop, you'll get a little movie, like, exactly what the United States would end up doing to almost the rest of the world with Hollywood, right? Hey, exactly. That's soft power, right? The power to colonize in a cultural way, right? Of course. To vindicate the teaching of one's own history, right? To engage in politics openly and to foster a bit more social awareness about the problems that attracted a land delimited by imaginary lines called Mexico and tons of collective memory. Up to this point, we're only talking about Bosé and Mexican muralism, but there, the real isms come into play, isms, of which we have to give at least a glimpse of what they were, because what I want you to see, kind and affable radio listeners, is the cultural explosion that occurred at this time, not only in the visual sense, because almost everything I'm going to tell you also had its tentacles in literature, in theater, in the other arts. So, very important. Before this, I'm getting a little bit off topic from the 1920s, but it's very important for people who don't know about it to know about it.
No, don't get off topic from the 1920s. No, it's not true.
No, at that moment I say no. Cubism. Cubism is very important for all these things that I'm going to talk about, and that you also talked about, and that you're going to be talking about after watching this episode. Your children. And your children's children will do it too, right? Well, those who don't. Well. Just kidding. Cubism, to put it quickly and badly, come on, let it go. It was an artistic milestone in trying to condense the dimension of time in paintings, which are obviously 2D, right? Yes, 2 dimensions. Cubism tried to include not only the 3 in paintings, which had obviously already been done since Da Vinci, right? We're talking about 3D. Obviously, they wanted to include it there, right? Something else could be found. But they wanted to include the passage of time among all those strokes, looking at the object from a different perspective, from different angles. Why is this important in Cubism as a primordial ideology, right? Of all this, because it also does it in cinema, right? Because in literature, it also does the breaking. We hadn't seen it. And all this also has to do with the beginning of the century, Freud, and blah, blah, blah. As human beings, we try to turn history around, and the most subtle way to do that is by introducing time, like in Benjamin, Button, like Scott Fitzgerald, like in Joyce's Louise, etc., etc. That is to say, giving time a place, prostituting time, making it a king, giving it a house. Then it becomes a clown, a magnate. Time is everything, and it is nothing. Playing with time. Playing with time was the important thing, that as an ideology, both artistic and collective, it was the important thing at the beginning of the century. And of course, it had its peak in the 20th century, in the 1920s. Yes, the 20th century, the 1910s, because it was a period between wars, don't forget that. So let's start talking about art, which is an abbreviation of decorative art, right? Broadly speaking, it's let's decorate everything. Let's decorate everything like hell, right? With slightly organic lines. But above all, we're going to make everything a little more chic, as they say, right? Let's make it a little more chic. To put it quickly, and so that you understand, because that's what decorative art is. It obviously has many other implications. But let's leave it there. Talking about realism. Which, to put it this way, the realists were pretty damn fed up with the line, the use of color, and volume to represent reality. That is to say, they sought to more intellectually approach the representation of the true, mere perception of the truth of reality. I say this about realism to emphasize how different they began to make everything, because from here on, out of realism, we go to hell with everything, right? Why? Next, Dadaism. Dadaism, which was based on rebelling against literary conventions, of mocking the bourgeois artist, and in itself was a primitive posting that sought to make something beautiful out of randomness, but the mere fact of being expressed with confidence.
Like, I'm going to say things randomly, but with complete confidence in what I'm saying. That's
how on this program, Radio Locura 66.6, Dadaist at heart, I say things in a humorous way. Sometimes there were also performances that seemed theatrical, but this time you would see it full of nonsense, right? the theater of the absurd, right? That's where it comes from. To the point that this movement is called Dada, or Dada, taking up the babbling of a child, right? That's exactly what I just did. Inside their little heads, it could sound like this absurd thing was going to challenge eternal beauty, the eternity of principles, logic itself, and the immobility of thought. Let's not stay with that, with the age thing. We try to be as profound as possible by saying absolutely no. Surrealism already touched a little by you. I touched surrealism and surrealism touched me. Influenced directly by Dada, it sought to promote the expression of the dreamlike and the irrational, as you had already said, through the automatic expression of thought or the unconscious. A disclaimer. Many times you will come across the word subconscious, and the word subconscious does not exist. It is unconscious. This was a linguistic disclaimer. The word does exist, the term as such. Oh yes, as in the application. Sure, this was more than in an artistic sense, a philosophical proposal, to be able to see not beyond what we perceive, but much further here, closer. The most here. Come here, come here. Taking Ricky Martin as a standard, right? But dreams. To dwell on dreams and irrational things without meaning in such a magical way so that they take on a deeper meaning due to their lack precisely of structure or resemblance to reality. That's why it's surreal. This is surreal, brother. And now let's go with the most damn sexist sons of... Futurism is something that also reached its peak during this period, functioning as a clear capture of Italian cultural evolution, which, needless to say, was its proposal for the future, hence its name. Of course, it was a standard bearer, as I said, of the explicit machismo of the time, openly stating that they despised women and were in favor of militarism and war, which they believed to be the only hygiene in the world. Man, screw that, man. Yeah. Like Hitler's final solution. They were also part of this ideology, right? They were a seed of that. In fact, they were the seed of fascism. No, it's no surprise to anyone that this served as the prelude to fascism, since little by little they converged on the idea that extreme intellectual, political, and physical violence was the best option. It was everything to them. They said in so many words they were idiots, right? Yes, but artistically speaking, they believed that speed and stridency were what mattered in order to endow the world with beauty. They said something, I've completely forgotten all that, but something like that. A car going at high speed was much more worthy of beauty and admiration than any work by Raphael, a sculpture, whatever, right? Their visual proposal, the truth is not very different from Cubism, which was like lines and geometry that were a little decomposed, but it's worth seeing. Don't stop educating yourself just because these guys were idiots. Sexist piece of It should also be noted that it's interesting art, terrible people. That's it. There was also you were telling me about a counter proposal, right? Feminist.
Yes, in fact, there was a futurist manifesto for women, right? Where they were just saying, hey, we agree. Listen, we agree with that issue of speed, technology, violence, changes, all that is perfect. Well, that is perfect. Yes, but what's wrong with that open and systematic depreciation of women? It's stupid, because if the future is better and speed is better, it includes all human capacity. But anyway, there is a futuristic manifesto for women. That's right. The author of the futuristic woman's manifesto is called Valentine S. Point, that is. Valentina del Santo Point.
Which is a direct response to the sexist futurist manifesto, right? Where she tells them, all good, but what's up with being shitty sexists so that the data is accurate?
Precise. And finally, let's go with abstractionism, right? A topic that we've already talked about in the ILMA AFC chapter, so if you haven't seen it, we're going to label you on that side. Ilma Klint, the greatest exponent in the shadows, the founder rather, but not the greatest exponent. The greatest exponent is Basil Kalinski. But anyway, what is abstractionism about? What the hell is extinctionism talking about?
That what? That's about doing...
Without, that is, throwing away the figure, the symbols, everything that has an anchored meaning, right? Making the signifier for the signifier's sake, right? The signifier is empty for the form for the form, the form for the form, the point for the point, the line for the line. Hello and goodbye. Stroke by stroke, verse by verse. Trying through form, color, point, and line to provide humanity with the lack of meaning in the figure and focus a little more on the magic of not understanding anything and experiencing everything at the same time. With training, which is a bit like what Ilma Klint had in these moments that he went through, right? While he was making the paintings that we talked about in that episode. Go check it out. And also Kandinsky, who in a certain way made him a little more admissible to the public so that they would take him in a slightly lighter way. The Suprematists with their White on White by Malevich, for example, is like, what a great work. Would have thought of putting white paint on white paint. That's a freaking genius, right? And, well, that's abstractionism. That's all that. I'll finish with that because there are many more, but I brought you the ones that I feel are a little easier to, not easy to digest, but important to know, right?
The ones that also have that pedigree of the passage of time, right?
Yes. And as a curious fact, I want to
Be alive, I want to feel, I want to express something.
also to the chapter of IMF Klint and closing a little bit that of the attractionisms, that in Latin America we have a Colombian also abstractionist. The first abstractionist.
I love that.
Yes, her name is Carolina Cardenas Nunez, excuse me. And she was the first one who did abstractionism in our Latin American lands.
How great?
That important fact, that does not have anything to do with that, but I just wanted to put it as an annex. Anyway, we are talking about earthquakes, and with this we are going to almost close the program, unless I save your better opinion.
Of course not. Look, I know things about literature, and I have already said them, and it seems perfect to me.
So let's talk about, I just want you to keep in mind that all these earthquakes I've talked about and everything we've talked about in literature, music, and film have a lot to do with this period between the wars when people wanted to feel freer. Everything I've already said in this chapter, but there's something very important that we haven't mentioned. What are those roaring 20s, or how do you see them in the dystopian 20s that we're living in right now? In the age of information, or disinformation, right? Whatever you want to call it. Something that's taken with a lightness, a certain dystopian nature, yes, well, a certain lightness in the works of Aldous Huxley and George Swell, 1984, right? And Brave New World, not respectively, because I said it the other way around, but anyway. Those are the works. The truth is drowned in a sea of information, right? Information that may or may not be true, but that's what we live in now. We're in an era where we're endowed with a consumerist spirit of mothers. We're drowning in that. Yes. And all that has a certain meaning. That's why I mentioned, for example, Bauhaus. And we mentioned these types of things because they're the beginning of many of the things that we essentially experience today when we open our cell phones while we're taking a dump first thing in the morning.
Well, basically the whole urban issue of consumerism and mass displacement comes from the roaring 20s. I mean, Mexico happened a little later because we're always behind due to that economic issue, but that's where the world emerged to be, of course.
And what I would like to highlight in terms of art in general, right, of all these isms, is that right now I think we have too many things, right? No, not because it's too much in an absolute sense, but because there's so many things that we don't know where to turn, right? At that time, everything I had told them, well, in one way or another you found out that they were, let's say, a select group of people who were starting these artistic and ideological movements. Nowadays we are provided
with too much information, and we can look at many things. What seems a bit catastrophic to me in these times is that there is too much and we don't know where to look, right? And it is more than obvious that we need critical thinking, something that filters everything we are experiencing and everything we are also trying to express, to make it a little less chaotic when expressing it, and so that people also understand our own messages as artists, as people too, right? Because now, on the same social network where you see your favorite artist, you also see your aunt who is uploading photos of the food you just had with her 3 hours ago. And you see someone's wedding, and if that someone doesn't want you to see the wedding, they don't invite you and they don't upload photos to their Instagram, right? Or they mute you or things like that. So I want to close with a reflection on this. Obviously talking about the roaring 20s. It's a time that established many of our ills, but also our assets, right? Yes. Our intangible assets too, and ideologies that ultimately reach our times. And as people and as artists, I think we have a great job. In doing all this research, I assume that you also realize that there are many things that haven't changed, and there are things that have changed for the worse. Yes, but there's also the good side of things, right? Which is that we have much more technology, and we have plurality, which is what's important in this chapter, plurality. And that's something that we have to respect in these times, also hand in hand with criticism. And in the face of, as an extra note on what you just said, in the face of overproduction and the sea of information, there is also the hybrid issue of expressions, right? I mean, as we saw in this week's recommendation with Giorgio Grip, you already said it, but there are many musical genres crossing many songs and happy accidents of the hybrid, right? Right? Also with novels that have one part on the internet and another that is downloadable. And, well, I don't know that there are no borders in the sea of information, it's true, but also that there are no borders in the way of expressiveness of the current roaring 20s, right? So in that sense of being the great-grandchildren of those roaring 20s of the last century, those roaring 20s are also that hybrid.
But it is also happening to us expressively.
Yes, we invite you to reflect on all this. Thank you very much for your reflections, which are always accurate and profound, and we want to open up the conversation about this. That's why this is a special chapter. We want you to tell us what you think about everything we tell you and what your perceptions are about current events. Also, what's remarkable about all this in simple terms is that we can realize that in the roaring 20s there was an explosion of artists and people, either very correct or very incorrect, who were anxious, extremely nervous, and eager to find a new foundation that would change the world once and for all. This was the spirit of the time in terms of art, and it's something that continues to resonate to this day, like a thirst that never goes away. That is sometimes intermittent, but that always tries to find a new way of perceiving the world. It's comparable to the dystopia of information that we are experiencing now with Instagramism, TikTokism, and YouTubeism, which in a certain way, as we said in the conversation with Bause, is increasingly entering into us as consumers of our own ideas. I produce something that, far from understanding it at first, the first thing that comes to mind is to monetize it, to make a spectacle of artistic and intellectual martyrs so that everyone can learn how radical other people's ideas are, and so we find ourselves drowning in the open sea that is now the exchange of opinions, which seems to be more like a vast breeding ground for new individualities. But in a certain way, we are living more like goldfish, selling each other out into other people's abysses instead of swimming upwards to at least experience the sunshine of the natural, the unartificial, the uncontrived, which is living a simple life connected to ourselves. We are constantly being asked to have an opinion about something in particular. The topic of the day, the popular news of the week, who is better than the other, who starts faster, who has more resources, who grows faster, and who says the stupidest things in the world. In the face of all this, we forget our freedom.
Despite no longer living as we did in those distant roaring 20s, a century later we are still just as empty and increasingly empty. There is no technology or new earthquakes that can replace the truth of our actions towards ourselves or those who will soon surround us. You should not have an opinion about everything. You are not obligated to politicize things that are beyond your control. The universe itself collapses into galaxies because otherwise it could not find its own order. Being isolated from everything is not the solution, but neither is caring about absolutely everything that happens in the world and in the universe. The universe. Worry about yourself, and about the world that immediately surrounds you. It is more than enough. It is more than enough if you can improve it with a detailed perspective. Improve your immediate surroundings, especially what happens in the world. Learn and be critical of what it means, and apply everything you learn from it, but do not form opinions about things that simply bring you anguish and unease. Just because you want to know more and be within the assumption that you must be intelligent and consume information as if your only purpose were to be here on earth to consume and be consumed. I only invite you and our listeners to reflect and not draw conclusions too early and too subtle to have an impact. Impacting our immediate reality is more than enough, and let no one take away our right to make politics by being ourselves without conforming to trends or fashion. We are more powerful when we do not feel like ants in this inescapable sea of consumption and information. Now, let's not have an opinion about everything. We do not need to know everything. We don't need to have an opinion about all this. Let's reaffirm our freedom to deal with our reality collectively, but without using confusing opinions from people we neither know nor understand in their context. In the face of all this sea of information and misinformation, let's use our freedom to say, I don't have an opinion about this, critically and creatively, so as not to say stupid things or act erratically. I'm Alex Iriana.
I'm at Almost Javier.
This was Radio Locura 66.66 FM. Idiotic ideas by an intelligent agent.
Bye.